Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister at the University of Toledo.
We really are in an important event, surely in the cultural life of the city of Toledo, but really of world significance as this rediscovery of a great artist, and especially from our viewpoint of a very religious artist, someone who painted explicitly religious paintings, and not only that, but I think has a spiritual dimension to much of the work.
Joining Father Bacik in today's reflections is Father Roland Calvert, Associate Pastor of Pius X Parish in Toledo. Today's reflections focuses on the topic of El Greco and the Counter-Reformation. Here's Father Bacik.
Roland, I know you have been to the Toledo Museum of Art in the recent past and taken in the El Greco exhibit and been so impressed with it, so I thought that maybe you and I could speak some more about that particular topic. You were indeed impressed, weren't you?
Oh, it's a magnificent exhibition. The New York Times, in reviewing it, I think when it was still in Washington, said that it was the unique experience one could have in a lifetime. It's not just hyperbole, it's true, that to bring those paintings together. I really hope that Roger Mandel will write a book or an extended article or something. I think it would be fascinating to find out how he did that and how you go about a complex thing like that.
It is such a coup, and especially when we think that the exhibit appeared in really only 4 cities,
Yes.
In Spain itself, and then in Washington, Toledo, Ohio, and then Dallas, Texas, I think, is the next stop on the tour. And it really is a remarkable event. And I think also in terms of the fact that El Greco is still in process of being rediscovered, as you read some of the history of the situation and what the art historians are saying, evidently there were a long period of time when he was not in favor and really was considered to be sort of wild or mad or far out as a painter. And as I get it, it's only in the 19th century and into the 20th century that there is this recovery of interest in El Greco and some sense of his greatness as a painter. So that seems to be part of the uniqueness here, that we're really getting in on a rediscovery.
Well, one of the articles in the exhibition catalog pointed out that there really is no other example as dramatic as El Greco as far as reversal of fortunes go. He died in 1614, and after that disappeared for all practical purposes. And if he ever was mentioned, it was as a footnote, as an eccentric or a madman, or at least a minor artistic figure. And then, as you say, in the late 19th and in our own century, very much a rediscovery of his genius. And I think it's interesting to reflect on that even from the viewpoint of El Greco's paintings and that whole religious thing, the vanity of vanities, and that life is very unpredictable. This is sort of a reversal of it. Not that you had glory, and then you lose it, but here's a man without glory, and suddenly he comes back into his own. But it still is the same basic point. Life is very unpredictable, and you'd better not put your happiness tied up with fame and fortune and stuff, because it does not.
It can be very fleeting.
It can, yes.
One can't predict all of that.
Yes.
Well, we really are in an important event, surely in the cultural life of the city of Toledo, but really of world significance as this rediscovery of a great artist, and especially from our viewpoint of a very religious artist, someone who painted explicitly religious paintings, and not only that, but I think has a spiritual dimension to much of the work. I think if we're going to try to understand the work of El Greco, and a lot of people have been to the museum and others are going to be seeing this exhibit, it is most helpful to me, at least, to see him in light of the Counter-Reformation period. And I think that a little bit of a rehearsal of the history of that might be helpful. That we remember in the 16th century that the reformers like Zwingli and Luther and Calvin had great disagreements with the way the Catholic Church was being run, about many of the devotional practices. They were upset with theories of justification, of the way the scriptures were used, the way the cup was not available to the lay people, and a lot of the moral lapses of that time. And indeed, there were a great many abuses going on. And the reformers wanted to change that. And I think that they had a really prophetic sense of things and the directions that things needed to go. And as time went on, it appears as though they get backed into a corner. At least that's my reading of it. And I think especially of Luther here, I guess. Not really wanting to go outside of the church, not wanting to start another denomination in any sense, but just not finding it out, not finding a rapprochement with the church, not finding any flexibility among church leaders. As someone once said that if Pope John the 23rd had been Pope in the 16th century, the time of Luther, we never would have had a Reformation. That all we needed was somebody to say, here's a way to save face, or here's a way out of the corner, or let's sit down and talk this over together, how we might reform the church.
Sure.
So that caused the Protestant Reformation, and then we find in the Catholic world the response to that in the Council of Trent, famous council, major meeting of the church, which lasted from somewhere around 1545, I think it was, to 1563, an 18-year period. They really had 3 different sessions going on there devoted to different issues. But they had some strong doctrinal things to say against the Protestant positions, some mild reforms that they wanted to initiate. And then after that, we move into what is known as a Counter-Reformation period, where the decrees of the council were carried out, and especially as we begin to think about what went on in Spain there, where El Greco settled in 1577 in Toledo and really lived as part of the Counter-Reformation period. Well, I just wanted to sketch that so people can at least get a feel for the 16th century, be reminded of that, the reformers, Luther and Calvin especially, the Council of Trent in the middle of the century then, and then the long Counter-Reformation period, which many people feel lasted all the way into our own time, up to 1962 when the Second Vatican Council started. We can talk more about that, but when we're talking Counter-Reformation world, we're talking a world that most Christian people know, if not explicitly, a world that really continued of defensive struggles, polemics, all the way up into our own time.
Sure. When I was in the seminary in the 1950s and early 60s and ordained in 65, the decrees of the Council of Trent were still in effect. I was very much affected by that, and Vatican II is really the watershed mark that changed that. You know, in
Before you go off that, let's just stay on that in a minute. That is so true. That I studied theology in the seminary, late 50s, early 60s, ordained in 62. It was from a defensive and polemical side. That is, it was always a question of how do you prove that the Protestants are wrong. I mean, there are 7 sacraments, and this is why there are 7 and not 2 or 3. And then you had your Bible quotes to show that, and a council decree, often from Trent, to back it up. And so that is really helpful for people generally to understand what's going on in both the Protestant and the Catholic world, because on the other side, in the Protestant world, their theology was often defensive and polemical also. That is, trying to show how the Catholic position was wrong. And isn't that remarkable that that would last over 400 years up into our own time, and how lucky we are that that's really changed, and that we have a new kind of atmosphere.
The ecumenical age, things were frozen. It is amazing, even the language of the Mass, which changed to the vernacular only in our own lifetime. That was 15 years ago or so. I find that amazing. I think it might be worth mentioning in your historical overview that there are some writers who make a distinction about that Counter-Reformation, and they don't like the term, so they speak of Catholic Reformation. And I think they make the point, which has some validity, but like most things, truth is complex, and probably Counter-Reformation is as good. But they say that it was not just a reaction against Luther and the other Protestants, but actually the Reformation had already begun within the Catholic Church, and that was a continuation of it. So there are some of them that I've read, and try to make a distinction and even get a little bit vehement.
I decided to stick with that term. I've used that term Counter-Reformation because it is the common one that is used, and because it does capture a part of that whole movement, which was the defensive reaction.
That's true.
And I think that a lot of that does come out in El Greco's work, which is the reason for bringing this up. I mean, the fact of the matter is that much of El Greco's work reflects that counter-Reformation period and the themes that were contained in this attempt to show that Protestants were wrong. But I would buy your point as well that we could find another term, a Catholic renewal or revival or church reforming itself, that did go on during that period. But it still seems to me the great stimulus for it was the things that Luther and Calvin had said, positions they had taken, the breakup of Christendom, which really dictated much of what went on in the theological Christian world at that time.
And of course, Trent eventually did change some of the things that Luther and others complained about, the indulgences and abuses in various ways. So it is mixed. You know, you had, if Luther had stayed within the church, he would have been a Catholic reformer. Of course, many of them began breaking, and then that's where the great division and the unfortunate hatred and that defensiveness and the emotion. I mentioned to you, we had lunch just before, about how repulsed I am by the period. You know, I find it exciting and turbulent, and the art of El Greco is wonderful. But I'm glad I do not live at that time. It's a negative period, really, in so many ways, for the hatred and the smallness and the sectarianism that goes on.
You know, I think one of the interesting things is how much more rigid and harsh the counter-Reformation period became than the council itself. Let me just give some examples of that. One that comes to my mind is the use of Jerome's translation of the Scriptures known into Latin, known as the Vulgate.
Sure.
Well, the Council of Trent stressed the importance of that translation, but left an opening to the use of other translations.
Sure.
But it was much later in the Counter-Reformation period, and I'm thinking around 1590 or so, that a papal decree came out saying that indeed the Vulgate was the only one that one could use.
Yes.
Now this is sort of a telling example in my mind of the rigidity that set in. In other words, the church became more reform-minded, more defensive than the council itself was.
Sure.
And that affected, I think, the mood of this whole period that El Greco ended up living in.
Well, there was a contemporary of El Greco, Fray Luis de Leon, a priest in Salamanca, who was a theology professor. And you will enjoy this, I'm sure, because probably you will also not desire to have lived in very much. But Fray Luis criticized the Vulgate after that particular pronouncement. He came out in one of his lectures and said, I don't think it is the perfect translation. He was thrown into prison by the Inquisition for 4 years. And I copied his sentence down from a book called The Counter-Reformation, which uses that title, by A.G. Dickens. It says that the Inquisition in Salamanca, after 4 years, was still not satisfied. And this is the exact sentence, that they recommended that torture be applied and that a moderate amount of agony would suffice in this case, since he had such bad health. Now, that kind of religion is what I'm talking about. I don't comprehend it. You know, it seems so totally foreign to our Lord and what he taught.
I know. It is such a shame. You know, it raises the whole question of the Inquisition. That's what people often know this period under. And maybe we can just sort of get some feel for all of that. You know, there was all throughout Christian history there would be appearing this notion, really, that somehow you could coerce the faith, that it was to be a Christian and to preserve Christendom, the unity of the state and the church, was so vitally important that coercion could be used, and there were great thinkers that seemed to go along with all of that. And when we move into the Middle Age period, then we find out that the church, it was, I think, 1234, where the church took over the work from the state of finding the heretics, and then would hand them over to the state in order to often be tortured or forced in one way or another to recant their heretical viewpoints or their divergencies from orthodoxy. Now, I think that one of the things to understand the Inquisition, it seems to me, is that notion of Christendom, that indeed the church and the state were so bound together that very often the secular rulers thought, along with the church, that if that heresy was a threat to the civil order of things.
Yes.
I think there was one time when Philip II, who was the emperor in the time of El Greco, said something about that it is 20 inquisitors that hold my kingdom together. In other words, he saw these people not just as we would see them today as on witch hunts in terms of religion it doesn't mean anything, but that these people held the state together, the very notion of Christendom, the very reality of the union of church and state. So I don't think we can understand the Inquisition apart from that, but even then it becomes such a terrible thing, and especially it's associated with Spain. The Spanish Inquisition is the one that we often think of. In 1478 it was established in Spain that they would have their own Inquisition and that they would have a Grand Inquisitor. And, they put people to death. Sure. They burned people at the stakes. I think in the first 8 years of that Inquisition, there were 700 deaths. And then when we move into the time of the 16th century, there were something like 300 Protestants who were burned at this time. And, of course, this goes on the other side as well. There were Protestant communities that ended up persecuting the Catholics as being the unorthodox people, and there were also killings in relationship to that. It wasn't all the way up till 1834 when this Inquisition was finally dissolved. Yes. It's just a horrible period in the history of Christianity. I think it really indefensible, but possible to see in the perspective of this church-state relationship and the desire on all sides to hold Christendom together.
Sure. Well, the kind of religion that was being practiced, it seems to me, is not essentially different from what you see in Iran today with the Ayatollah or Jerry Falwell, I would think, in my opinion anyway, and various others. If there's a fanaticism with religion and a willingness especially to use violence to enforce what that religion's about, some of the worst things in the history of humanity have been done in the name of religion and even of Christianity. And when I think about that and read of periods like this with large numbers of people being killed for sorcery or heresy, whatever the charges are, and that this is done in the name of Christ, that is what boggles my mind. I can't comprehend it.
It is really strange. It creates what I call a religious paranoia in the culture. And I think back to El Greco's Spain. He went there in 1577. There was an interesting event that occurred in that very same year in the Carmelite order, where St. John of the Cross, famous mystic of the 16th century, was interested in reforming the Carmelite order and was going about doing that. And they called his group the Discalced Carmelites. They didn't wear shoes. And the other group of Carmelites, the more traditionalist one, at one point kidnapped him, took him to the city of Toledo, put him in a little cell, something like 7 feet by 11 feet, something like that, and would take him out at dinner time and have the other monks beat him. And not just ceremonially, but in a way that caused him permanent damage to him.
And chanted a psalm while they did it, the Miserere, a religious act.
I know. It was almost, it's really hard for us to comprehend, but it shows you that strange thing that was going on right in Toledo. In fact, the Archbishop of Toledo was put into prison for 4 years. One occasion because he was thought of as being deviating from orthodoxy. The Archbishop of Toledo.
Well, another of the paintings that the Metropolitan Museum did not send, I think it was in Washington, is of Cardinal Guevara, I think his name is, the Grand Inquisitor.
The Grand Inquisitor, yeah.
Fascinating painting, and you look at that, and your first impression is of a man who is very frightening and whose power is immense. But as you look at it closer and you see his hand grasping the chair that he's sitting in, you begin to realize this man is also afraid and not quite sure that he won't be the victim next.
Yes, that is a powerful piece. It's too bad it isn't in the exhibit here because I think it's one of El Greco's more powerful paintings. And what it represents to me is a blast at the Inquisition and its harsh measures. It makes me think that El Greco didn't buy into all of that because he paints that cruelty on his face and that indecision in his body and that the way his hand is curled up and so on, as you mentioned, gives a whole different feeling. I'm reminded of Dostoevsky's passage about the Grand Inquisitor when Christ comes back into Spain, and the Inquisitor arrests him again, and he throws him in prison, and he says, well, what have you come back again to do? Free the people?
Yes.
Don't you? We have learned that you can't free the people.
Yes.
They are like sheep. You have to watch over them all the time. And that's a heavy burden we've got, but we've got to accept it, and we've got to get rid of you a second time
Yes.
because you want to free the people. That's one of the more powerful passages, I think, in literature,
Oh, it is.
which shows the terrible character of the Inquisition. But
Sure.
I see that same sort of
Sure.
diatribe against the Inquisition in that painting of El Greco of the Grand Inquisitor.
Oh, definitely. You have to look a little more carefully because your first impression is a fairly standard portrait of what you think an inquisitor would look like, and he would scare the daylights out of you. But the fear, the internal fear in the man is fascinating. I don't think I'm much more sympathetic to him, to tell you the truth. I mean, he is involved in something that is evil, but you begin to see the humanity behind there, and that they're all trapped. It was just a terrible world to live in many ways.
And no way to see out of it. That your phrase that you feel
Yes.
trapped in that world, what you are often is psychically trapped
Yes.
into that world. You don't know any differently, that you don't see any alternatives. I'm afraid there's people walking around today, Christians, who still live in that defensive, polemical
Sure.
atmosphere. They grew up in a family where there was bigotry or hatred, or there was common to put down other religious traditions, and it just, one is imprisoned in that world and
Sure.
doesn't really see an alternative. That's one of the great things about our time is with the ecumenical movement, I think, is that there's alternatives available, that
Yes.
there's Christians walking around who are trying to get along with one another
Sure.
and not be fighting, where we're doing theology now in a cooperative way, when we're trying to work together, have common services and so on. At least those who are still suffering from the narrowness of prejudice see an alternative. But in El Greco's world, you probably couldn't find that.
Sure.
The whole world was paranoid in that way.
It might be comparable to living in a limited area like Lebanon. The headlines not long ago, which were so horrible, of the massacre that occurred, Christian militiamen or Christian phalangists going in, talking about contradiction in terms, to do that in the name of religion. And as you say, then not to have just even a city, but the whole country and maybe the whole continent in some way to share in that.
Yes.
It's a very narrow and frightening world, and thank God that has given way to ecumenism and to what I think is much more faithful to the sources of our religion and to what the Lord taught.
Surely, no doubt about that. You know, Roland, when you walk into the El Greco exhibit, it really helps to keep in mind this counter-Reformation background, because so much of the subject matter is determined by those themes that were involved in the Protestant Catholic debate. So you see all of these paintings of Mary,
Yes.
the sinless Virgin, the center very often of the painting,
Yeah.
almost more so than Christ. You get the impression that Mary was so central to their piety.
Sure.
We see the paintings of Mary Magdalene and Peter, who seem to represent the importance of forgiveness and repentance, and I think had links with the sacrament of penance at that time, the importance of confession, which was often denied, at least by one wing of the Reformation. And it seems as though El Greco wanted to point out, no, he shows Peter in tears, but he has the keys with him, the keys that are to bind and to loose that we associate with the sacrament of penance.
Sure.
So we see many different themes, I think, dictated precisely by the times. Those patrons who paid El Greco the money wanted him to paint things that fit in with the doctrinal orthodoxy of that time.
There's one painting that combines two of those things you mentioned, which is fascinating, of the Holy Family with Mary Magdalene. And he had done a number of versions of it, and I think it's the only example, they said, where he substitutes, I believe, for St. Joseph, no, for St. Anne maybe, Mary Magdalene. And you have the contrast between this woman who is lowering her head, who is penitent, who is sorry for the life she has lived, immediately juxtaposed with the radiant face of Mary. And it's a beautiful contrast of those themes.
I think it was the idea that repentance was possible,
Yes,
in fact, and that forgiveness was then available for people. No, I think that to keep that in mind really helps in locating El Greco. You know, there's an interesting fact about him, that he was on a council in the city of Toledo, which was job it was to judge the orthodoxy of works of art. Now that is revealing to me. It makes me think that El Greco, while he was not into the harsher measures of the Inquisition, was indeed interested in this doctrinal orthodoxy, or at least was thought to be an orthodox person in his own time, and his paintings seem to portray it. It makes me think he was indeed sympathetic to the major themes, at least, of the Counter-Reformation.
And yet lived with a woman who was apparently his mistress. I find that amazing. Apparently it was doctrinal and not moral things that got you into hot water with the Inquisition.
You know, it was in the Council of Trent, a key decision was made very early between two wings. One wanted the emphasis on moral reform, reform of the church, straightening out these situations. Another wing, the curial wing from Rome, wanted the doctrinal emphasis. And indeed, they won out. And the major thrust of Trent was doctrinal. And although there were moral reforms thrown in, but major thing was doctrinal. And I think maybe that, I don't know that that's the linkage. I don't know why they allowed him to have a mistress and still be on this council and be a part of the elite of the city. I don't, but it does link up in my mind that the emphasis was doctrinal and not moral reform. You enjoyed the exhibit.
I loved it.
Even with the Protestant, or with the Counter-Reformation themes.
I did. I find it fascinating, we might talk about it in a later program, why it is that Spain has produced so many great painters, even adopted ones like El Greco. The Picasso exhibition comes to mind, and this one. I mean, they're wonderful celebrations of life, and they don't seem to have comparable numbers of musicians or other artists.
Nations have been good at one thing or another. And the Spanish seem to be in tune with religious kinds of themes very often.
Except Picasso wouldn't.
Yes, although I think that's underneath the surface. Well, Roland, I want to thank you for discussing this with me. And I think that one of the things we want to get out of all this is that we're glad that defensive period is over and we live in an ecumenical age where Protestants and Catholics and people of various religious backgrounds can get along and dialogue together.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister at the University of Toledo. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Father Roland Calvert, associate pastor of Pius X Parish in Toledo. The topic of this week's Reflections was El Greco and the Counter-Reformation. If you have any questions about today's program or any ideas for topics you'd like to hear discussed, please write to Reflections in care of WLQR, Toledo, Ohio, 43623. Produced in the studios of WLQR, Reflections is directed by Mary Beth Kirchner. Reflections is brought to you by the Genesis Radio Network.